Great pleasure for me this afternoon to introduce our guest and our speaker. And I'm going to do that not by giving you the standard Wikipedia introduction, you've got that on the bottom of your handout, but by telling a story that's intended possibly to embarrass the speaker and myself. The first time I met Alvin Plantinga was, I think it was either late 1976 or early 1977. He and his family, some of whom are here today and welcome, were living in Oxford at the time, as was I. I was a postgraduate student, supposedly in English, but my supervisor got rather tired about hearing about issues concerning free will and foreknowledge and all of that sort of thing, the problem of evil, which is what I was studying. So he seconded me to an Oxford professor by the name of J.R. Lucas. And in the course of my conversations with J.R. Lucas, he said to me, do you know that there is a brilliant young American philosopher visiting Oxford whom you should speak with? Now you have to remember that in 1976, you could occasionally hear brilliant and young in the same phrase together, but you would very seldom hear the phrase brilliant American. It was sort of an oxymoron. So in spite of this unusual introduction, I did the email equivalent in 1976. I wrote a little note, put it in a little envelope, and made sure it got into Professor Plantinga's pigeonhole, and then he wrote me a little note back and made sure that it came into my pigeonhole at St. John's. We were literally a stone's throw apart because he was at Balliol, and I went and had a wonderful visit with him and learned a lot about, yes, foreknowledge and free will. And I remember the result of our conversation was our agreement that in spite of what good fellows they were, both Calvin and Augustine were in fact compatibilists. So it's a very peculiar, and this is an old-fashioned word, but it's a very peculiar privilege for me today to introduce to the UBC campus someone whom I've admired for a very, very long time. Please will you welcome me and join me in welcoming Professor Alvin Plantinga.
Thanks very much, Dennis. Can people hear me all right? It's very nice to be introduced as a brilliant young philosopher. There might be a bit of an oxymoron in that. And thanks very much for your introduction, Dennis. He says it's a peculiar pleasure to introduce me. I'm not sure exactly how to understand that. This talk is, well, first of all, I'd like to say it's a pleasure to be here at UBC. Again, I've been here at least twice before. The other times were way back in the last century, purely within living memory. But this is at least the third time I've been here. And I'd like to say, second, this talk is a philosophy talk. Something went wrong here. This talk is a philosophy talk. My guess is not everybody here is a major in philosophy or is a student, or a philosopher is not a student. And well, you can sort of understand why. Philosophy has a bit of a bad press nowadays. Partly that's because in philosophy you have to think about some kind of sort of unpleasant, miserable scenarios or states of affairs. So, for example, there is being a brain in a vat. You know, the idea is you get captured by alien scientists. They remove your brain from your skull and keep it artificially alive in a vat of nutrients, and they attach leads to it, and the other end go to their Apple computers, and then they type in there whatever it is they want you to think or feel or experience, right? Then the thought is, well, if things were like that, then everything would look to you just the way it does, right? So how do you know that's not true? Well, that's kind of a miserable thought. Another miserable thought that philosophers have often to be involved with or get engaged in is solipsism. Solipsism. Solipsism is the thought that I'm a solipsist if I think I'm the only thing that exists, and everything else is just a figment of my imagination. Right? So that's what a solipsist is. That's not a very pleasant thought. I remember years ago in my first job, I met an actual solipsist. I heard there was one on campus, so I went to see what a real solipsist looked like. It didn't look that different from everybody else. Actually, he was quite friendly. I mean, he was quite cordial, even though I was just a figment of his imagination. I thought he treated me pretty well, you know. I mean, not all figments get treated that well. So we had a little conversation, but after a while we ran out of things to talk about. So I took my leave, and as I was leaving, one of his younger colleagues took me aside and said, you know, we take very good care of Dr. So-and-so, because when he goes, we all go. So this talk is about religion and science and possible conflict between religion and science, where the conflict really lies. So I say, there are a number of people who say there is a serious conflict between religion and science, and say that as a result, religion has to be thought of as irrational or substandard or such that no thinking, sensible, educated person could accept it, and the like. Among the people who say that sort of thing are some of the dreaded four horsemen of atheism, not the four horsemen of the apocalypse, not even the four horsemen of Notre Dame, which I used to teach at, but the four horsemen of atheism. Daniel Dennett and Richard Dawkins, Sam Harris, and Christopher Hitchens. In particular, Dennett and Dawkins have both made this claim that science and religion conflict. Therefore, religion is something that no sensible person can accept. It's worth noting, if only in passing, that the fact that science conflicts with religion, if it does, I mean, I'm going to argue that it doesn't, but if that were a fact, that wouldn't necessarily mean that there was anything wrong with religion. The fact is, science conflicts with itself, so they tell us. Relativity theory on the one hand and quantum mechanics on the other hand, so they say, can't both be correct. They can't both be correct. If that's really true, then science conflicts with itself, and since a self-contradictory proposition is inconsistent with any other proposition, it would follow that science conflicts with everything. And so the fact that it conflicts with religion would be nothing special. But I don't want to pursue that line of thought. I want to talk about something different. You might ask, where does this alleged conflict arise? Where do people think there is conflict between science and religion? Well, some people think there is conflict between, say, physics on the one hand, and what you might call special divine action in the world, which would include, among other things, miracles, special divine action in the world. The thought is if God acted specially in the world, he would have to act in such a way as to go contrary to the laws promulgated by physics, so there'd be conflict then between any religion that asserts that God acts specially in the world, that is, acts beyond creation and conservation, on the one hand. There'd be a conflict between any such religion and science, and physics. Another area where there is alleged or real conflict is between Christian belief or religious belief and evolutionary psychology. So evolutionary psychology gives a kind of account of how it is that people hold religious beliefs, what their function is in their lives and the like, and these accounts very frequently are incompatible with religious belief. But I want to talk about one particular area, an area that's been with us for a long time, and that is evolution. I want to talk about evolution and ask if there is conflict between Christian belief in evolution, Christian or more generally theistic belief in evolution, whether there is conflict, and I'll argue that there isn't. You can see there on the handout that I hope you all have a copy of, is where I sort of outline what I propose to talk about. I say, I'll argue, one, that contemporary evolutionary theory is not incompatible with theistic belief, or with Christian belief. And two, that the main anti-theistic arguments involving evolution, together with other premises, also fail. So somebody who thinks that evolutionary theory just as such is incompatible with theistic beliefs would say those two can't both be true. But someone else might say, well, that's not quite right, but evolution and theism and some obvious other premises, they can't all be true. So there's got to be something wrong there with Christian belief. All right? And three, I want to argue this. I want to say that naturalism, and now naturalism is defined variously by different people. I think the simplest way to think of it is as the idea that all there is the natural world. That's all there is. So one way to put it, naturalism is the idea that there isn't any such person as God, the God of the theistic religions, or anything like God. All right? Naturalism, then, is the thought that there's no such thing as the God of theistic religion or anything like God. That's an essential element in the naturalistic worldview, and the naturalistic worldview is itself a sort of semi-religion or quasi-religion. That is, it plays some of the same roles that a religion does. It tells us what our prospects are, what's most important, what's most real in the world, how people should live, and the like. All right? So the naturalistic worldview is a sort of quasi-religion, and I want to argue that naturalism is in fact incompatible with evolution. Naturalism is, evolution is ordinarily thought of as a sort of pillar in the temple of naturalism. What I want to argue is that that's a complete error. Naturalism and evolution don't fit together at all. So I say there is a kind of science religion, or maybe science quasi-religion conflict, all right? But it's a conflict between naturalism and science, and not between theistic religion and science, all right? And when I speak of theistic religion, I'm thinking of Christianity and Judaism and Islam. And when I'm thinking of Christianity in this context, I'm thinking of what C.S. Lewis calls mere Christianity. Something like perhaps the intersection of the great Christian creeds, the Apostles' Creed, the Nicene Creed, the Reformed Belgian Confession, and the like of that. What they all have in common, that's what I'm thinking of as mere Christianity. So in section 1 here, contemporary evolutionary theory is compatible with theistic belief. Now the term evolution covers a variety of theses, just like somewhere in the New Testament it says love covers a variety of sins, so evolution covers a variety of theses. First of all, the ancient Earth thesis, the idea that the Earth is very old, billions of years old, maybe 4.5 billion years old, vastly older than people thought, say, 200 years ago or before that. Second, the thesis of descent with modification, that's the idea that the enormous variety to be found in the living world, and it is enormous when you think about it, all the different species of animals and all the different kinds of plants and so on. That enormous variety has come to be by virtue of offspring varying in typically slight ways from their parents, and then these changes, these slight variations accumulating in various ways so that the final result is the enormous variety we see in the living world now. Then number 3 is connected with that, the common ancestry thesis, which is the thought that all living, if you pick any two living creatures and trace their ancestry back far enough, you'll find a common ancestor. So we're all cousins, all right? It's not just the case that all we people are cousins, but we people are also cousins of any of the other animals. And also, as far as that goes, cousins of plants. Poison ivy, you and the poison ivy in your backyard are cousins. That's easier to imagine for some people than for others, but that's the thought. All right. Then the fourth thesis is Darwinism, which is the claim that the principal mechanism driving this whole process of descent with modification, what's bringing all this about, is natural selection. Natural selection winnowing random genetic mutations. So the thought is a certain mutation arises within a given population, Most mutations are either lethal or neutral, but a few are adaptive and fitness enhancing. So the creature that winds up with that mutation will tend to leave more offspring in the next generation than creatures without it. So in this way, that mutation will spread to the whole population, and the whole process can start over. And of course, processes of this sort, many of them are going on all at the same time. All right, and by virtue of that process, you get again all the variety that the living world displays. Okay. Well, now let's ask what, if any of this, is incompatible with belief in God, theistic belief, or more specifically, belief in Christianity. First of all, the ancient earth thesis. Well, it's hard to see how that's incompatible with mere Christianity. God could have created the universe a very long time ago. Some Christians think that God created the universe very recently, but that's not part of Christianity as such, or part of mere Christianity. That would be a kind of special variety. So the ancient earth thesis seems consistent with Christian belief and with theistic belief. Descent with modification. Again, God could have created by a process involving descent with modification. That too seems consistent. Common ancestry. God could have also brought it about that all living creatures share a common ancestry as far as you go back. Remember about Adam and Eve, you could imagine God selecting a particular pair of hominids at some point, maybe 100,000 years ago or something like that, and bestowing on them a special quality whereby they could be said to be in God's image, and if that quality were heritable, then when their descendants will also be in God's image. And hence it could be that all of us today are descendants of Adam and Eve, of that original pair, which we can call Adam and Eve. All right. Now, where there might be some more serious possibility of conflict is with respect to number 4, Darwinism. The idea that the whole process driving this whole mechanism is this process of natural selection working on random genetic mutation. And in fact, very many people say that Darwinism is inconsistent with theistic religion. Again, Dawkins and Bennett say so. You might ask, well, where exactly is the conflict supposed to arise there? It has to do with the fact that, according to theistic belief generally, that is, according to Christianity and Judaism, and at least some varieties of Islam, God has created human beings in his image. He has created human beings in his image. And this means that God has created human beings in such a way, first, that they are rational, intellective creatures, creatures who can think, creatures who can reason, creatures who can form beliefs. And second, he has created creatures in such a way that they also have a moral sense. They've got some idea as to what's right and what's wrong. They can see that certain kinds of actions are just wrong, others are right or to be approved of, to be done. And then perhaps a third element of creatures in God's image would be a capacity for some kind of relationship with God, some kind of being in touch with God. People speak of a personal relationship, some kind of way of being able to speak to God and perhaps to hear God speak to them. Okay? That's one part of what it is for God to have created human beings in his image. The other part is this, that if God has created human beings in his image, then he intended that there be creatures of a certain sort and took the kind of actions that would be required for there to come to be creatures of this sort. So he intended or planned or took a certain kind of action to bring it about that there be such creatures. He thought about this in advance, right? So from this point of view, if people did come to be by virtue of evolution, it would have to be by virtue of a guided evolution, a process that was guided, orchestrated, overseen by God. All right. So what's not consistent with Christian or theistic belief is to claim that evolution and Darwinism are unguided, where that will include being unplanned and unintended. What's not consistent with Christian belief is the thought that human beings have come to be by virtue of evolution, where the evolution is thought to be, where the evolution is unguided evolution. Okay? But there's a veritable choir of distinguished experts who insist exactly that evolution is unguided. So, for example, here's George Gaylord Simpson. Man, and I'm adding here no doubt woman as well, is the result of a purposeless and natural process that did not have him in mind. I suppose Simpson didn't include woman. I suppose it might be possible to argue that man is a result of purpose. Women aren't. They're planned somehow. I don't know. I won't go into that further. Second, Stephen Jay Gould says, if the evolutionary tape were to be rewound and then let go forward again, of course you couldn't really rewind it, but you get what he means anyway, and then let go forward again, the chances are we'd get creatures of very different sorts. And we probably wouldn't get anything like human beings. We probably wouldn't get anything like creatures in God's image. We might be said, you see, what sometimes he says what we most likely would get is just a whole lot of bacteria, because bacteria are extremely successful as forms of life. And as it stands, bacteria, took all the bacteria in the world, put them on one end of a seesaw, and all the other living creatures on the other end, the bacteria would win. All right. So he said, so his idea is that if the evolutionary tape were to be rewound and let go forward again, we'd get creatures of a very different sort. And that means then that that implies that it's not the case that God, creating the world, intended that there be creatures in his image. Then in a famous passage here, Richard Dawkins, whom I mentioned just a bit ago, a famous passage in his book, The Blind Watchmaker, he says, all appearances to the contrary, the only watchmaker in nature is the blind forces of physics, albeit deployed in a very special way. A true watchmaker has foresight. He designs his cogs and springs and plans their interconnections with a future purpose in his mind's eye. Natural selection, the blind, unconscious, automatic process which Darwin discovered, and which we now know is the explanation for the existence and apparently, not really, but apparently, purposeful form of all life, has no purpose in mind. It has no mind and no mind's eye. It is not planned for the future. It has no vision, no foresight, no sight at all. If it can be said to play the role of watchmaker in nature, it is the blind watchmaker. That's what he says. That's Dawson's claim. And the subtitle of his book is Why the Evidence of Evolution Reveals a Universe Without Design. The evidence of evolution reveals a universe without design. All right? So I say, what's incompatible with Christian or theistic belief is the thought that human beings have arisen by evolution and that evolution is unguided. And I went on to say that there's a veritable choir of distinguished experts who say that evolution is unguided, including Simpson and Gould and Dawkins. Well, to return to Dawkins then, I'd like to ask this question. Why does Dawkins think natural selection is blind and unguided? What does he think that? Why does he think that the evidence of evolution reveals the universe without design? How could the evidence of evolution reveal a thing like that? That's the question. Well, here's what Dawkins does in his book. He really does three kinds of things. First, he recounts some of the fascinating anatomical details of certain living creatures and their ways. So when he does this, he's very good. He writes in an intriguing and interesting way. He talks, for example, about bats and how they can fly through a completely dark cave with stalactites coming down from the top and stalagmites coming up from the bottom. or maybe it's the other way around, but it doesn't matter. Anyway, with these stalags flying between them and amidst them at an enormous rate of speed without so much as brushing, even brushing any of them. And his description of that is fascinating. Second, he tries to refute arguments for the conclusion that blind, unguided evolution could not have produced some of the wonders of the living world. For example, going back to his own day, St. George of Navarre argued that mammalian eye could not have come about by blind, unguided evolution. And that's partly because there are so many intricately related parts that if you made a change in one part and didn't make corresponding changes in the other parts, you would reduce visual acuity and not improve it. Well, he tries to refute these arguments. And thirdly, he makes suggestions as to how these and other organic systems could have developed by unguided evolution. That's what he does in the book. And all of his detailed arguments are for the conclusion, really, that it's possible that these various systems and organs could have come to be without design. It's possible that they should have arisen by virtue of blind, unguided evolution. All right? The form of his main argument in the book, then, remember, he says the evidence of evolution reveals the universe without design. Well, how does he argue for that? What's the form of the main argument? It goes like this. Premise: we know of no irrefutable objections to its being biologically possible that all of life has come to be by way of unguided Darwinian processes. Something like, you might say, no one has proved that this is not possible. No one has proved that it's impossible. Therefore, conclusion, all of life has come to be by way of unguided Darwinian processes. All right? So you get the argument for him. It's no one has proved it's impossible that P, therefore P is true. Now, philosophers sometimes give uncogent arguments, and I'm sorry to say I've even given some myself. Everybody can. But hardly any are as uncogent as that one. Imagine, I come home and I tell my wife that the President of the United States and the Prime Minister of Canada have gotten together to strike a new philosophy medal, which carries with it a $50,000 stipend. And I say, and I'm the first recipient. And she said, oh, that's nice. Why do you think that? And I say, nobody's proved it impossible. What kind of an argument is that? I mean, that wouldn't pass muster in my house, and it shouldn't pass muster anywhere else. This argument, as far as I can tell, the main argument that Dawkins actually offers for this conclusion, that the evidence of evolution reveals the universe without design, is completely uncogent. It's possibly P, therefore P, which is just not a sensible kind of argument. I mean, possibly there are an even number of stars, so there are an even number of stars. Possibly there are an odd number of stars, so there are an odd number of stars. So, I mean, if you follow this argument for me, you'll wind up thinking they're both an odd number of stars and an even number of stars. I mean, in general, it's just an altogether unsatisfactory kind of argument. So Dawkins, I say, utterly fails to show that the facts of evolution reveal a universe without design. Still, the fact that he and others assert his subtitle loudly and slowly, as when you're talking to a kind of recalcitrant 9-year-old, you hold him right in front of you and speak loudly and slowly, you must clean your room. The fact that he and some of his colleagues assert his subtitle loudly and slowly can be expected to convince many that the biological theory of evolution is, in fact, incompatible with the theistic belief that the living world has been designed. All right? So in a way, he takes it that the fact that it's possible that this is true is sufficient for saying that it is, in fact, true. Okay. Well, you might say, what about the fact that these relevant genetic mutations are said to be random? It's natural selection working on random genetic mutation. The term random has a variety of uses, and in this context, here's what it means. Here's Ernst Mayr, who was the dean of 20th century evolutionary science. When it is said that mutation or variation is random, the statement simply means that there is no correlation between the production of new genotypes and the adaptational needs of an organism in a given environment. And Elliot Sober, a contemporary philosopher of biology, puts it like this, where he's perhaps the most eminent contemporary philosopher of biology. He says, well, what it means is this: there is no physical mechanism, either inside organisms or outside of them, that detects which mutations would be beneficial and causes those mutations to occur. There's no physical mechanism, either inside an organism or outside of the organism, that detects which mutations would be beneficial for this particular creature and causes those mutations to occur. So the point is that a mutation accruing to an organism is random, just if neither the organism nor its environment contains a mechanism or process or organ that causes adaptive, that detects which mutations are adaptive and then causes them to occur. But clearly a mutation could be both random in that sense and also intended and indeed caused by God. So, I say, the claim that evolution demonstrates that human beings and other living creatures have not, contrary to appearances, been designed, that claim, that's not a part or a consequence of the scientific theory of evolution as such at all. What it is a metaphysical or theological add-on. It's added by some people, it's added by naturalists who want to co-opt evolutionary theory for their own purposes. It's a metaphysical or theological add-on, but not part of the science itself. Okay? Here's a slightly different tack. As polls reveal, most Americans, I don't know about Canadians as much, have grave doubts about the truth of evolution. Most Americans, not just some, but most. Many Christians are concerned about the teaching of evolution in the schools and want to add something as a corrective, intelligent design, or ID, for example. Or they want evolution taught in the schools as a mere theory rather than as a sober truth. Or they want it to be taught along with objections to theory. All right? Why do we do so? Well, here's one reason. We are regularly told by the experts, Dawkins and Bennett and Ayala, Gould, and others, the current scientific evolutionary theory asserts or implies that the living world is not designed and that the evolutionary process is unguided. For example, the National Association of Biology Teachers, until 10 years ago, officially described on their website, described evolution as, quote, an unsupervised, impersonal, unpredictable, and natural process. So if we're regularly told by the experts that in fact the theory is a theory of unguided evolution, the theory of evolution is a theory of unguided evolution, it's no wonder that many Christians believe that. Further, if they do believe it, it's no wonder they don't want it to be taught as a sober truth in the public schools. Thus understood, evolution would be incompatible with Christian and Jewish and Muslim belief. Clearly there are questions of justice here. Would it be just to teach in public schools positions that go contrary to the religious beliefs of most of those who pay for those schools? Well, I won't discuss that question further. Now, I'm going to skip the next section, broader anti-theistic arguments from evolution, in the interest of saving a little time, and go on to section 3, naturalism versus evolution. All right? I said I wanted in the third part to show, or to argue at least, that evolution and naturalism don't go together at all, even though evolution is sometimes thought of as supporting naturalism, even though naturalists are very enthusiastic about evolution. I want to argue that they don't go together at all. All right? So, first of all, I want to use the letter N as an abbreviation for naturalism, which, to repeat myself, is the thought that there is no such thing as God, no such person as God, or anything like God. I want to use N, that letter, to abbreviate naturalism. I want to use the letter E to abbreviate the idea that we've come to be by virtue of current evolutionary theory, all right? Or maybe more generally, E can just be current evolutionary theory. And I want to use the letter R to abbreviate the proposition that our cognitive faculties are reliable. And when I speak of our cognitive faculties, I'm thinking of such things as memory, for example, whereby I know something about what happened in the past. For example, that we drove down here or up here from Washington, from Linden, a little earlier today. In fact, I can remember things that happened much longer ago than that. Perception, whereby you can learn something about your immediate neighborhood. I can see, for example, that there are lots of people here, that there's a black or green board behind me and the like. And of course, you can, by perception, also learn things about things that aren't in your immediate neighborhood. For example, the sun and the moon and the stars. Okay? Those are cognitive faculties. Logical intuition, whereby you can learn mathematical truths and logical truths, such truths as that if all men are mortal and Socrates is a man, then Socrates is mortal. All right? That's another cognitive faculty. So there are other possibilities here too, but those would be among three most important cognitive faculties. All right? And we all just assume, without even thinking about it, that our cognitive faculties are reliable. So if it seems to me, I look out the window, it seems to me that I see a tree, I will ordinarily just take it, well, there's a tree there. I just take it for granted that what perception reveals to me is in fact true. And the same for memory. Of course, on special occasions, you might have some reason for mistrusting what seems to be, what you seem to see. I mean, maybe you're in a fun house or something like that where everything is very peculiar. Or maybe you know that your memory plays you tricks in a special area. But for the most part, you just take it utterly for granted that your cognitive faculties are reliable. And I want to use the letter R for the proposition that they are reliable. Okay? Now, the first premise of the argument here is the probability of R on N and E is low. That expression, P of one thing on another, that we could call conditional probability. It's a thought that we have all the time, although we don't always use that term to describe it. Conditional probability, the probability of one proposition given that, or on the condition that some other proposition is true. All right? So, for example, the conditional probability that Jock is a Mormon, given that Jock lives in Scotland, that's fairly low. There aren't that many Mormons in Scotland, and the ones there are probably aren't named Jock. Contrast that with the probability that Brigham is a Mormon, given that Brigham lives in Salt Lake City. Well, that probability would be a whole lot higher, right? So the probability of one thing given that something else. And that will differ, of course, for different propositions. The probability that Mr. A will live to be 80, given that Mr. A is now 30, seriously overweight, never exercises, eats only junk food, and has grandparents, all of whom only live to be 50, that probability is pretty low, right? Contrast that with the probability that Mr. B will live to be 80, given that Mr. B is now 70, runs 11 miles every day, watches his diet like a hawk, is not the least bit overweight, and his grandparents all of whom live to be 100, that probability is vastly greater, right? So you get the idea. Conditional probability, the probability of one proposition is given, or on the condition that some other proposition is true. Well, the first premise then says that the probability that our cognitive faculties are reliable, given that naturalism and evolution, those two things are true, it says that probability is low. All right? Everybody get the idea? I mean, you don't have to believe it, but you see what it is. That's the first question. All right. Then the second premise is one who accepts naturalism and evolution, one who accepts it or believes it, and also sees that number one is true, sees that P of R on NE is O, has a defeater for R, a defeater for R, where a defeater for a proposition is some proposition you learn, you come to believe, such that as long as you believe that one, you can't sensibly believe the defeated proposition. All right? Let me give you an example. I look into a field and I see what I take to be a sheep off in the distance, a ways away, and form the belief there's a sheep there. But then the owner of the field comes along and tells me that he never keeps any sheep in the field, but he does have a sheep dog that from that distance, this distance looks like a sheep. All right? Then I've got a defeater for my original belief that I saw a sheep there, and I will no longer continue to believe that. Okay? So I say, if you accept N and E and you see that one is true, then you'll have a defeater for the proposition that your cognitive faculties are reliable. You'll have a reason to give it up, a reason to no longer accept it, a reason to reject it. Not necessarily a reason to believe that your faculties are not reliable, but a good reason for not believing that they are reliable. Okay? Okay, then third premise, this defeater can't be defeated. One thing about defeaters is that they can themselves be defeated. So you can have a defeater-defeater, or even a defeater-defeater-defeater, and so on. I mean, after a couple of editions of defeater, it gets kind of boring. But the fact is, defeaters can be defeated. So, as in the case I was giving a moment ago, when I got a defeater for my belief that there was a sheep in that field, I got that defeater because the owner came along and told me that there were sheep in that field, but he doesn't have a sheepdog that looks from this distance like a sheep. Later on, I encountered his wife, and he said, you know, I'm sorry to tell you this, but my husband's got this thing about sheep. He always says there aren't any sheep in that field, but there almost always are. So, well, then I've got a defeater for my defeater. And I will return to my original belief that I saw a sheep in the field. All right? So the second premise says that if you accept N and E, and you see that one is true, you've got a defeater for R. The third premise says this defeater can't be defeated. We could call that an undefeated defeater. What you get is an undefeated defeater. All right? And then premise 4 says, if you have an undefeated defeater for R, for the proposition that your faculties are reliable, then you have a defeater for any belief that you take to be produced by your cognitive faculties, right? If you have a defeater for the proposition that your faculties are reliable, you'll also have a defeater for any belief that you take to be produced by your faculties. So, for example, someone tells me something, I'm at a party, somebody tells me something, I believe it. Well, then if I get a defeater for my belief that that person is reliable, I'll get a defeater for any belief I acquired by virtue of what that person tells me, right? Okay, so the same thing here. One who has a defeater for R has a defeater for any belief she takes to be produced by her cognitive faculties, including N and E itself. That's one of the beliefs she's got, and she takes that, of course, to be produced by her cognitive faculties. All of her beliefs are produced by her cognitive faculties. So she has a defeater for N and E. Therefore, it follows that N and E, naturalism and evolution, that combination, is self-defeating and can't rationally be accepted. We can't sensibly believe both naturalism and evolution. Maybe you can believe naturalism sensibly, maybe you can believe evolution sensibly, but you can't sensibly believe their conjunction. You can't sensibly believe them both, all right? And if that's true, then there is a conflict between naturalism on the one hand and evolution on the other. Evolution is a central a central important part of contemporary science. So there's a conflict between naturalism and a central part of science. So you might say there is a science-religion conflict, or science-quasi-religion conflict, all right? But it's not between theistic or Christian belief and science. It's between naturalism and science. Okay. Now, one final thing here. So there are these four premises of my argument. I think 2, 3, and 4 are pretty clear. Somebody might worry, though, about premise 1. Is it really true that the probability of our faculties being reliable, given naturalism and evolution, is low? All right. Is that really true? Well, I want to argue in conclusion, I give you a reason for thinking that it is really true. First of all, I want to take naturalism to include materialism. Materialism, as I'm thinking of it here, I mean materialism about human beings. So materialism is the idea that human beings are material objects through and through. They don't have any immaterial soul or immaterial mind or immaterial ego. They are just material objects. Augustine and Descartes and most thinkers until reasonably recently have always thought human beings were essentially immaterial objects. I guess I lost this thing. So nobody's been able to hear anything I said, right? I've got to start over. So Augustine and Descartes and most thinkers until reasonably recently have thought of human beings as immaterial objects. In this way, sort of like God, who also is an immaterial object. So part of being in God's image is being like God, an immaterial object. In the case of human beings, though, as opposed to the case of God, we immaterial substances and material objects are intimately connected, each one of us, with a particular material substance, namely our bodies. All right? Now, the materialist thinks that's not true. The materialist says, no, I just am a material substance. Maybe I am my body, maybe I am my brain, maybe a part of my brain, but in any event, whatever I am, it's a material substance. And I say I want to include that idea under naturalism. First, most naturalists are, in fact, materialists. I don't know any really who aren't. But in any event, I want to argue that what really is in conflict is, excuse me, is this trio of propositions: naturalism and materialism and are the propositions that are talking fact is very reliable. All right. Okay, so here's the argument for premise 1 then. I say take naturalism to include materialism about human beings. From the point of view of materialism, a belief will presumably be a structure or an event in the nervous system, perhaps in the brain. So if you ask, well, what kind of thing would a belief be? I mean, or a believing of a proposition. What kind of thing would that be if materialism is true? Well, it doesn't seem like there's much of a possibility of it being anything else than some kind of material event or structure in the nervous system, right? In your brain, or maybe some other part of your nervous system. Okay? It'd be something like a neuronal structure of neurons firing away in certain ways. That's what a belief would have to be like. Let me draw you a picture of a belief. This is the belief that all men are mortal. So if a belief really is a structure of neurons in the brain, then presumably it would be possible to take a picture of it. It might be distributed in such a way that you can't really take a picture of it. But if it isn't distributed throughout the whole brain, maybe it's all in one place, that belief, then you can just take a picture of it. Maybe that's what the belief that all men are mortal looks like. All right. Okay, so then next, Instead of thinking about ourselves, think about a population of creatures on some distant planet, perhaps in some other universe, and suppose that naturalism and evolution hold for them. What we can assume about these creatures is that their behavior is adaptive. They've come to be by virtue of evolution, so their behavior is adaptive and is conducive to survival and reproduction. This behavior is caused by processes in their brains. So what causes a bit of behavior, like my arm going up, would be a signal sent from some part of my brain down a channel of nerves to the relevant muscles, causing the muscle to contract, and up goes my arm. All right. This behavior, this adaptive behavior, is caused by processes in their brains, which we could call the underlying neurology. That neurology, furthermore, is also adaptive. We can say that the underlying neurology is adaptive because it causes adaptive behavior. This neurology, furthermore, also causes their beliefs. All right, so the underlying neurology causes behavior, and it also causes beliefs. But so far as the adaptive behavior is concerned, so the underlying neurology causes adaptive behavior. As far as the behavior is concerned, it doesn't matter whether those beliefs also caused by the underlying neurology are true or false. All that matters is that the right kind of the underlying neurology causes the right kind of behavior. If it also causes beliefs of one kind or another, that's fine, but it doesn't matter to the adaptive behavior. All right. If true, that's fine. If false, that's also fine. Either way, the underlying neurology causes adaptive behavior. So if that's the case, then so far as evolution goes and the adaptive behavior goes, it doesn't matter whether their beliefs are mostly true or mostly false or half and half. So take any particular belief on the part of one of these creatures. We're talking about a population of creatures on some distant planet. Take any particular belief on the part of one of those creatures. What's the probability that it's true? Well, there's as much reason for thinking it's false as for thinking that it's true. The best you can say is it's got to be about 1/2. But then the probability of R, that their faculties overall are reliable, that's going to be low. If, let's say, for 100 beliefs, the probability with respect to each one that it's true is 1/2, then the probability that, say, 3/4 of those beliefs are true, which would be required by reliability, that'll be very low, like 1 out of 1,000,000. All right? Okay. Okay, that's one way to argue for it. I want to argue for it another way as well. So here we've got this belief, this big old belief you like. A belief will have two kinds of properties. First, it will have neurophysiological properties. All right. And those of you in the back see this, neurophysiological properties? If you can't, what it says is neurophysiological properties. Those would be properties that specify how many neurons there are in that belief. Maybe there are, I don't know, 180 neurons, or 180,000 neurons, or 1.8 million neurons in that belief. All right? And how the neurons are connected with each other is another neurophysiological property. How this one is connected to that one, for example. What the rate of fire is in the various parts of this structure, the rate of fire with these neurons. How the rate of fire in one part responds to changes in the rate of fire in another part. What sorts of signals are sent from this belief, from this neuronal structure via nerves to muscles? That would be another of the neurophysiological properties. What kinds of inputs there are from other such neurological structures, or maybe from sense organs. Okay, those would be neurophysiological properties. There is also, if this is a belief, another kind of property it is. It has to have a content property. It has to be the belief that P, for some proposition P. Maybe it's the belief that all men are mortal. You know, all men are mortal. All right? That's its content. It's related in its special weight to that proposition as opposed to all the other propositions that there are. Okay, so there are these two kinds of properties, content properties, on one hand, and these neurophysiological properties on the other. Now, if you think about it, a belief so thought of as a neurological structure of some sort, a belief so thought of can cause behavior. It can cause muscles to contract. It can cause an arm to go up or cause somebody to walk around the room, that sort of thing. Any kind of behavior you like. It can do that. And the question is now, how does it do it? Well, it does it by sending some kind of signal down the appropriate efferent nerves to the appropriate muscles, causing contraction, and thereby causing the behavior. All right? But the point here is that the content doesn't get involved at all. It doesn't matter what the content is, as long as the neurophysiological properties are the right ones, you'll get the behavior. It can be associated with any kind of content you like. It doesn't matter what the content is. So while natural selection can modify behavior in the direction of more adaptive or fitness-inducing behavior, and can also modify the neurophysiological properties of various structures, including of beliefs, in the same way that if neurophysiological, if any kind of such structure causes maladaptive behavior, it'll get weeded out by the process of evolution. Well, if that's the case, natural selection won't be able to do anything about content. It won't be able to see content, because content doesn't get involved in this way in the causal chain that leads to behavior. It's not by virtue of having a certain content that this belief causes what it does. It's by virtue of having these neurophysiological properties. All right? And this is all under the assumption that materialism is true. This is a consequence of materialism. All right. Okay, so it's for that reason that the probability of R on entity is low. So by way of conclusion then, if this argument is correct, and if it weren't correct, I wouldn't be doing it. If this argument is correct, it follows that naturalism and evolution are incompatible with each other. It follows that there is a kind of science, religion, or quasi-religion problem, incompatibility, but it's between naturalism and science, not between Christian belief and science. Thank you.
We have time for questions, so if you have questions, please boom them out and or raise your hand and boom them out.
Yeah. Yes. Okay, I'm afraid this is going to be a bit long, but I'll try to keep it to a minimum. I think it's very equally demonstrated that there's no real conflict between science and religion, or, mere Christianity, or brilliant philosophy, and I can quibble with some of your arguments, but I don't wish to, because I have something else I'd like to say. Although maybe I will put in one thing that it's kind of a weak defense of Dawkins. He was actually almost forced by the Archbishop of Canterbury to admit that he was an agnostic, not an atheist, which is a crucial point in my opinion, but let's leave that aside.
Let me just repeat what you said so far for people. This man says he doesn't want to quibble with my arguments, but he doesn't want to quibble with one of them, or something like that. Namely that Dawkins is not an atheist, but an agnostic. He thinks maybe the probability that there is such a person as God is 1 out of 100, something like that. But he won't just assert flat out atheism. Right, okay.
Okay. Moving on then, I'd like to advance a slightly more radical thesis, which is that religion, or perhaps better, spirituality and science can be friends. Now, why would I say that? Well, I think we could go back to an authority like Albert Einstein and say, religion without science is lame, science without religion is blind.
Religion without science is lame, science without religion is blind, says Albert Einstein.
In 1941,
Right.
I was not saying that. Okay, so then what does this mean in a particular instance? And the instance that occurs to me, because I'm somewhat of a physicist, is that there is a conflict resolution going on in the example you mentioned, which is relativity versus quantum mechanics, in the case of constructing the unified field theory, which again Einstein tried to do but failed. And this may or may not be resolved by having created, by scientists having created two things called quantum loop gravity or theory or superstring theory. Okay, I won't go into the details of those further because I'm not going to be able to do it. But
I wouldn't
not
understand
in
it
any
anyway.
point in time. But
sorry to interrupt. Could I ask you to move in toward the question that you'd like to ask?
yeah, okay. So that conflict resolution could be useful in a religion because we know that religions do squabble with one another and with sometimes fatal consequences. So if there were a way of creating a new religion to remove that conflict, that would be great. And I could give you an example, and that is the Sikh religion, which was a kind of conflict resolution between Hinduism and Islam, which is not totally effective, but seems to have something in its favor. So I'll leave it at that. That's really more of a comment than a question.
Yeah, okay. Right. Yes.
Your questions, so the emphasis on questions.
Forgive me if you address this, but
I'm sorry, I can't hear you.
forgive me if you address this, but if Richard Dawkins commits the fallacy of arguing from ignorance regarding natural selection, evolution, are you not committing the same fallacy by saying that God could have directed evolution?
Here's the question. If I properly criticize Dawkins for arguing from it's possible that evolution is unguided to evolution is unguided, am I not doing the same thing when I argue? But I don't argue. Didn't argue that evolution is guided. What I said is, am I not doing the same thing if I argue from, well, possibly it's guided to it is guided? If I did argue that way, that would be the same thing, right? Fortunately, I didn't argue that way. Because all I was trying to argue was that there isn't any conflict here. I wasn't saying as a matter of fact, I wasn't arguing, well, of course I do believe this myself, I wasn't arguing that as a matter of fact, evolution is a guided process. Right. Yes?
Oh, okay. So I have to admit, I didn't really follow your argument at the end. So this is your argument in 5 premises.
Yeah, I'm sorry about that. It's kind of a complicated argument.
Yeah, so one thing I think would help me clear it up is I think it seems like the notion of like proposition or propositional content and the notion of truth are doing quite a bit of work in the argument.
Yeah.
But so for those of us who study philosophy in the room, there's a lot of different sort of accounts of what these things are. So I was wondering if you maybe just say a bit more about that.
Right. Did everybody hear that question? The question was the notions of proposition and truth play a role in my argument, and what more can I say about them than what I did? Well, by propositions, I guess this will be kind of a circular. And by proposition, I mean things that can be true or false, like Ullmann or Worrell, 7 plus 5 equals 12, 7 plus 5 equals 15. These are all propositions. They are things you can assert, things that can be believed, and things that can be true or false. All right? By truth, I don't have any theory of truth. I don't think there is any theory of truth. But we all know what it is. It's true that I'm over 50 and false that I'm over 100. It's true that there are not very much you might think. It's true that there are a lot of people in this room, and false that 7 plus 5 equals 91. I mean, we all have this idea. We start with it, with the idea of truth. So I don't know what more there is really to say about it. One can refute various arguments for the claim that there isn't any such idea, or that nothing is true, or that nobody knows that anything is true, or something like that. But I wouldn't know how to prove that there is such a thing as truth. Does that help?
I'm still confused. I mean,
not really. Well,
so what if we're pragmatists and we say the truth is whatever works?
Well, we know that's not right.
No?
We know that's how false theories work. You know, lots of false theories have among their implications, true implications. You know, so obviously you're going to have false theories that have true consequences, and obviously I could believe that. I mean, suppose I believe that I'm a really fine fellow. Maybe that makes my life easier. That really works. It doesn't mean it's true. I mean, maybe I'm not a fine fellow at all, right? I mean, that's an example of a theory of truth. I was saying you can show that some of these theories of truth don't work or aren't accurate, even if you can't really say exactly what truth. Can't say what truth is. Not that I think it's a problem that you can't say what it is. It's just you can't say what it is because it's too basic.
Yeah.
It's an idea we all have from the time we're little tiny children. Yes.
I was wondering about you're talking about how the compositional content of the belief is independent from its neurological basis,
Yeah.
and therefore independent from adaptive evolution. Therefore, it doesn't have any. The content would be independent from adaptive evolution. Is that?
Yeah. The idea is that.
I gotta ask my question. If you understand that was just a preface.
I sort of understand it. Yeah.
Curious because it seems to me like reflective decision making.
I can't quite hear that.
It seems to me like reflective decision making, which we do in propositional. It's a propositional mode of thought to
Right.
try and make reflective decisions.
Right.
That can play a great role in whether or not one survives. So you think that could be a link between the propositional content of beliefs
Yes.
and survival. And if that was the case, then there should be selective pressure towards developing a what did I put it?
Reliable cognitive faculty.
Yeah, that's
Right.
the one.
Right.
Yeah.
Yes.
So wouldn't it then be fair for a naturalist to think that eventually people's cognitions might develop towards truth-tracking beliefs?
Well, you remember I said I wanted to take naturalism as including materialism. Now, what I was talking about here is an implication of materialism. So what you're doing is arguing that materialism is false. And I agree, it is.
Well, I'm not sure that's the case because just to, when we talk about beliefs as being propositional,
I can't quite hear you, I'm sorry.
I'm sorry, here, let me try to begin again. When we describe beliefs as being propositional,
Yeah.
that's from our subjective experience viewpoint. So perhaps, shorter question. When you call beliefs propositional, are you already making them non-material?
I don't know. But if I am, then it follows again that materialism is false because beliefs clearly are beliefs in some proposition, right? When I believe that all men are mortal, I'm thinking about a certain proposition, and I'm thinking that that proposition is true.
So, then propositional beliefs, but couldn't they? So as long as propositional beliefs can exist within the materialist viewpoint, then naturalists would have reason to believe evolution could progress towards truth-tracking beliefs.
I didn't quite catch the first part of what you said. I'm sorry.
I'm sorry. Okay. So
I think I know what she's getting at.
Well,
I was getting at, so you said that you weren't sure if materialists, you weren't sure if have propositional beliefs was already something that materialism would allow.
I'm not sure. I'm inclined to think maybe it would allow it because I think there are sensible materialists who certainly think that people have propositional beliefs like Peter and others, but I'm not sure about it.
Okay, so if that's the case, that materialism does allow propositional beliefs, then wouldn't it also be the case that naturalism would have reason to believe that what creatures could eventually evolve truth-tracking beliefs because it's beneficial survival-wise?
Now, see, that's the part where I think you and I disagree, or at least,
Well,
are you done?
I get, because of the reflective decision-making part.
Yeah.
Reflective decision-making happens, we experience it as a propositional act when we're trying to decide between different propositional beliefs.
Right.
And that affects our survival.
Right. What you're really arguing against there, it seems to me, is materialism. If materialism, I mean, the fact is, the content of our beliefs does cause behavior. It's by virtue of the content of a given belief that belief causes one kind of behavior as opposed to another. So it's by virtue of the content of my belief that there is a beer in the refrigerator, and I want a beer. It's by virtue of its content that belief causes me to heave myself up out of my armchair and go to the refrigerator, right? So there we agree on that. My point is that materialism doesn't support or permit that particular conclusion. If you want a technical term for it, materialism implies content epiphenomenalism. It implies that content is epiphenomenal and doesn't get involved in the causal change that leads to behavior. That's a consequence of materialism, though, right? So, if as long as the naturalist is also a materialist, he or she is saddled with that conclusion.
There's a gentleman over here who has a question.
Yeah. So say the materialist might accept your premise, but then say, well, okay, maybe we can't discover what truth is, but instead, what if we believe propositions that are adaptive to our survival, or like maybe believing premises that make us happy? Like, for example, maybe believing this premise is conducive to our survival, maybe we should believe it, or maybe believing a Christianity that's similar to your Christianity brings happiness, maybe we should believe that instead. Or do you think this is an acceptable strategy?
The question is, would I think it an acceptable strategy for the materialist to say, well, okay, maybe our cognitive faculties aren't reliable in the sense that they give us true beliefs, but they do produce some other quality. They give us beliefs that make us happy, or beliefs that enable us to get along in the world, and so on. Okay? Now, if that's what the naturalist is thinking, then presumably he's thinking with respect to naturalism itself, that it's the sort of thing, the sort of belief that makes us happy, or enables us to get along in the world. Well, I don't care about that. I mean, I'm just talking about whether it's true. Maybe it makes a naturalist happy. I've never seen a very happy naturalist. Maybe a naturalist who does that, or maybe for a certain kind of naturalist that enables them to get along in the world better. I mean, suppose you're that to survive and reproduce better. Suppose you're a naturalist at a school where everybody's a naturalist and non-naturalists are all despised. Well, then you probably, if you're in the 12th grade, and that's the way it is there, you won't have a girlfriend. So you probably won't, you may very well not reproduce, right? So naturalism could be useful in some context with respect to reproduction. It could make the naturalist happy. That's all fine with me. I just say the naturalist can't simply think it's true. Yeah.
Yeah. I really appreciate your argument. Thank you. I find the idea that natural selection cannot aim for truth to be very useful, and I think that's what you're saying. But I wanted to bring up your idea of properly based beliefs, and I'm having difficulty as a Christian. I really like your idea that the internal instigation of the Holy Spirit serves as a foundation to make that a properly based belief. But my problem is that I'm having a hard time seeing how I can be honest. How do how do I get to the point where I say, okay, I am so warranted that no defeater can come and take away my faith. At the same time, I want to be honest and hold my faith to scrutiny.
Hold your faith what?
To scrutiny. Like I might admire, say, I might admire someone who leaves Islam, maybe because he looked at it and decided it wasn't true. How do I find that same honesty within myself while at the same time saying, well, I'm so warranted that I'm never going to get there? Is there a dishonesty in me, or am I just not understanding?
No, I think that's worth thinking about. The question has to do with something else I said, something I didn't say in this lecture at all. Belief in God, or belief in the whole, and the great things of the gospel, as John Edwards calls them, is properly basic. It doesn't have to be accepted on the basis of an argument or evidence from other things of belief. And in that regard, it would be like, say, my belief that 7 + 5 = 12, or my belief that there are a lot of people in front of me. These two I believe, but I don't believe them on the basis of other propositions. I don't argue to them. I don't say to myself, well, I'm being appeared to in this kind of complicated fashion here. Usually when that's the case, there are a lot of people present, so I'm seeing a lot of people. That's not how it goes. I just look out and find myself with a belief there are a lot of people. Now, the question was, if Christian belief is properly basic, then I seem to be committed to the idea that I couldn't have a defeater for it. But then how could I sort of sensibly scrutinize it at all? How can I think about it seriously, as one is done to think about it in, say, university courses of one kind or another? Well, I think the right answer there is to say a belief is properly basic is not to say that it can't get a defeater. It certainly can. In the case of my example earlier on about saving sheep in the field, that belief was basic and properly basic, but I got a defeater for it. So it's not the case that if you think Christian belief is properly basic, then you also have to think you can never get a defeater for it and can never consider seriously the objections to it or alternatives to it, or anything like that.
We're going to have to call time on the question period. I'll ask Professor Plantinga to stay here for a few minutes. If there are urgent questions that you would like to come and ask them individually, let me thank you all again today for coming. Let me thank the Marin Commission for supporting Professor Plantinga's visit today to the graduate faculty before. And above all, I'd like to thank Professor Plantinga for being with us today.